Jacobs here. Okay. All right. So let me go. Okay. So let me present. Right. And go back here. All right. All right, there we go. Okay, so let me do that percent right now. All right, does everybody see that on their screen? Or do you guys see the slide?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So this is basically the second section in the chapter here. On Thursday, we were talking about we introduced the chapter and the whole concept of prehistory versus history, which chapter 1 is prehistory, right? And so the main difference, not the only difference, but the prime, kind of main difference is the presence of written records, right? So history, while not solely, but depends a lot upon written evidence and written records, either primary sources, meaning the kind of written of the day, either by the people that are making the history or the people that are recording it, or secondary sources, right? And then prehistory, essentially, they're dealing with other things like artifacts and fossils and stuff like that. And we had talked about how in the story of the Iceman, that the Iceman kind of left behind, obviously his fossil remains would be himself, right? But artifacts like his robe and rucksack and things of that nature, a quill. However, he didn't leave behind, let's say, a journal, right? So, the idea here where we have archaeologists and anthropologists who are kind of filling in the blanks there. The story of the Iceman, they've determined that he was probably murdered because of a arrow kind of indentation in his back, wound in his back, but we don't know why, by whom, because he didn't leave behind a journal or written records, if you will. And so we had talked about kind of also dating, how we date artifacts and fossils and such using carbon-14 dating, radiocarbon dating, or potassium argon dating, right? And so in many cases here, you kind of using kind of both to try to kind of fill in the blanks, depending on how old material is. All right, so this section 2, is primarily dealing with kind of this concept that we refer to as human evolution, right? All right, and so those who study human evolution often referred to as paleoanthropologists or the paleoanthropology. All right, paleo is just another term that means old, essentially. All right, now evolution as a theory, right? And it's a theory, although it's a pretty solid theory based on kind of scientific evidence and research and that. Like, for example, gravity is technically a theory, but nobody's floating in the air, right? Evolution, like most of you guys know from your biology classes, was a theory developed by Charles Darwin, and this idea that Darwin observed on the Galapagos Islands various species and noticed these kind of like subtle changes over time. These changes were primarily a function of basically survival. All right, so this idea that they would change certain shapes, like on birds and certain beaks, and kind of on reptiles and such. This idea that they would change certain things about their kind of physical features as a means to kind of protect themselves against the elements, protect themselves against predators, things of that nature. And then eventually, certain people kind of put that theory to our kind of trying to find our human origins, if you will. All right. And so this is at times can be a somewhat, a controversial subject that I teach based on people's religious beliefs. And my intention is not to kind of challenge anybody's religious beliefs. But the whole idea here with the kind of basically what we have as evidence in far as science to determine how we developed not just physically, but also mentally. And as we kind of develop from isolated creatures to those who are more social, right, and developing of cultures and civilizations, if you will. So in many cases, the kind of the story of kind of evolution, as far as kind of human evolution goes, is that this idea that there's a kind of a linear kind of transition and from our kind of primate kind of origins to our more modern species. So it's kind of in a kind of a linear kind of line there. In reality, that's a little misleading. In reality, human evolution is probably more like a tree. In certain cases, you have branch that basically other branches kind of like emerge from, all right? But then you have some branches that just die off. All right, like there was, for example, they discovered a human species named Homo florus in what is Indonesia that existed roughly based on the kind of fossil evidence. It existed roughly around the same time as kind of modern human species did, and Homo florus was particularly smaller. And so this was right around the time the Lord of the Rings movies came out. So they refer to him as Hobbit Man. All right. Another one, which we'll talk about on Thursday, would be Neanderthals, which they believe may be one of those kind of dead branches of the evolutionary tree. All right. So a linear kind of explanation is maybe a little too simplified, if you will. All right. Now, when he said like kind of basically, the study of human evolution is the study of kind of early hominids. Here's a hominid, if you weren't familiar with this. A hominid is simply a creature that walks upright. All right, and a creature that walks upright has the ability, or walks upright on two legs, I should say, has the ability called bipedalism, thinking like pedaling a bike, right? Bi meaning two. All right, now that doesn't strictly make one a kind of human, like one species kind of human, if you will. Like, for example, ostriches have the ability of bipedalism, but no one's going to confuse them with kind of a human species, if you will. But that is the kind of like the more contemporary idea that is initially the idea on what becomes human-like, if you will. All right, one of the major factors. All right, but also they're looking at the kind of the cranium size. Obviously with bipedalism, look at the leg bone and the pelvic bone, whether they were able to support a kind of creature that walks primarily on two legs, if you will. All right. So hominids, you would classify ourselves as hominids to a certain extent, right? All right. Am I moving too fast? You guys getting this? Did I put everybody to sleep at the same time? I haven't done that before. That's pretty impressive. Like I said, when you guys are here in class, I can see that happening in real time. I don't know what's going on here. All right. So one thing they definitely need to know about those who are kind of like those who subscribe to the theory of human evolution is that most of those scientists, most of those paleoanthropologists believe that all the early hominids that we classify in that linear kind of concept of kind of human evolution, or the kind of tree concept there, originated in Africa. All right, there's this concept of an out of Africa theory here. All right, so our kind of human species has its origins here on the African continent. Now, I have here it's like 3 to 4 million years ago. Our textbook is already outdated, really, to tell you the truth. All right, there has been some discoveries that even push that back even further, maybe 5 million years. All right, so eventually, at one point, our human ancestors leave Africa. They discoveries are found as far as Australia, into China, Siberia, other places, right? So there's a question on the test, all early hominids originate in this continent, and that's Africa. All right, that's our kind of like our origin of our human species. All right, now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of go from the classification of earliest to our modern species. All right. And I want to talk about two classifications, actually technically 3 classifications today, but one of them is not mentioned in your textbook. All right. So our story, according to kind of like the text here, and until like 2010, this is basically where this kind of story originates, is with a classification on the evolutionary tree here called Australopithecines. Now, I'm never going to make you guys write this out. All right. I typed it out for you there. But in a sense here, this was the oldest of the hominids up until 2010, up until recently. All right. Lived anywhere between 3 4 million years ago, based on the kind of the fossil evidence that we have. And the brain size based on the cranium, based on the kind of the skull size, about 1/3 the size of modern humans, they believe the brain was. All right. this discovery here wasn't totally fully accepted really until the 1970s. All right, and there was a lot of debate within the paleoanthropology world on whether Australopithecine was too primate-like to a certain extent to be classified within that human classification here. All right, and so essentially, this is a Australopithecine discovery. Now they've discovered part of a cheekbone, some teeth here. All right, now the kind of this is a mold here. All right, so a lot of times they're kind of filling in the blanks, if you will. All right. But from this rendering, they believe this is kind of what maybe Australopithecine looked like. Again, very primate. And so this is still not 100% of all kind of paleoanthropologists kind of maybe classify this, but a majority of them do within the kind of human evolutionary tree. All right. Now, when we're talking about all early hominids, all major Australopithecine discoveries, all of them, have been discovered only on the continent of Africa, primarily on the eastern and southern part of the continent. So stretching from like the Hadar region in Ethiopia, all the way down through the kind of Latoli region, Oldoi Gorge in what is the Great Rift Valley of Tanzania and Kenya, down into South Africa. All right, they've only been found in these areas. And what you have is certain areas that at one point had lush kind of grasslands, that a lot of them are now in kind of drier areas, which enable them to kind of maintain a lot of these kind of fossil remains, if you will. All right, so the first major Australopithecine discovery, the first one was discovered in 1924. This is referred to as the Tongue Child. All right, now the guy who's credited with this discovery is a professor, an Australian professor who was a professor at the University of South Africa there, named Raymond Dart. Dart was actually, he was the kind of the head of this dig, this expedition. The story was one day he was getting ready for a wedding, and some of the workers brought to him a discovery of a skull, which looked like kind of a very small skull, maybe that of a child, hence the name Tongue Child, the region that's discovered, and a leg bone and some other bones. But the leg bone was particular, leg and pelvic bone were particular because the femur itself was a little bit more elongated. It wasn't like a typical primate. All right, so Dart publishes his findings that the kind of what they would call the missing link was actually in Africa. Now, Dart wasn't fully accepted in the paleoanthropology world. Matter of fact, most of his findings were just disregarded, mainly because most paleoanthropologists were very Eurocentric. The majority of those who were engaged in this science were in Europe, and a very kind of I would say kind of like arrogant belief is that if we were going to find our kind of like our connection to our human past, it would be in Europe. All right. And so there was a discovery in England called Piltdown Man, which turned out to be a hoax, which actually was it was a mix of a bone, like the kind of the jawbone of a chimpanzee and the kind of like a leg bone and that of a kind of modern human species. All right. And so once that was determined to be a hoax, Dart was a little bit more, his findings were a little bit more accepted. All right, but a lot of these findings don't really they aren't really fully accepted until years later. All right, so there's Dart years later holding the skull of the Tongue Child. You can't really quite tell, but there's a kind of a hole in the back of the skull there to the side in which they believe that the Tongue Child was probably attacked by a bird of prey. So at this point, our human ancestors were not at the top of the food chain. All right, and the theory was bipedalism was a necessary means to kind of maintain survival. All right. So Dart wasn't really fully kind of vindicated until the mid 1970s with a discovery that you guys did a worksheet on yesterday called Lucy. All right. Lucy was discovered in Ethiopia, about 1,000 miles or so away from the discovery of the Tongue Child. They named their discovery after the Beatles song. All right, this is a relatively young group of paleoanthropologists led by a guy named Donald Johanson. All right, but him and Tim White were kind of the guys who kind of credited with the discovery. And like the article said, it was just by happenstance. It was kind of luck that they found it. They kind of went out and looked there. And so this was the most complete, best preserved Australopithecine. It was for a while, up until 2010, considered the oldest, most complete, best preserved hominid. But that changed, all right, a little bit here. But this adds to the story here, particularly with the concept of bipedalism being one of the first major factors that one kind of like basically kind of separate our primates from our kind of human ancestors, if you will. All right, and so this is a replica. If you go to the Field Museum in Chicago, they have a replica of this. The actual Lucy is in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, capital there. But about 6-7 years ago, they had a tour in the States where they kind of brought out Lucy to various museums, and the Field Museum in Chicago was one of them. All right. Now, the key is like they found rib bones, part of a skull, but the big key here was the pelvic bone as well as the femur, which indicates bipedalism. All right. By appearance, though, Lucy still looks very much like a primate. All right. And it's believed that she kind of like spent some of her time between trees and on the ground. Now, the theory is that she probably developed bipedalism in the sense as a means to look over tall grass, as again, our human ancestors were not at the top of the food chain there. All right. So the pelvic and femur bone, along with the size of the cranium, are key factors in the story of kind of like on the human evolutionary tree. There's my man Donald Johanson. All right. He was working for the Case Western University in Cleveland at the time. He's a graduate of the University of Illinois. That's a fresh look for paleoanthropologists. Any kind of tan and olive green is always a good look there. All right. Now, like I said, this was considered up until 2010 as the most complete kind of early hominid. However, in 1994, there was a discovery that was until 2010 that became official, where we have a new classification that predates Australopithecine called Ardipithecus. And that discovery was referred to as Ardi. And they made subsequent like other discoveries that are somewhat similar, but Ardi was the first one. All right. Ardi, like Lucy, was a female. This actually pushes the story of human evolution back another 1,000,000 years. All right. And so there was a number of like Tim White, Owen Lovejoy all worked on this discovery here. A lot of the same guys that worked on Lucy, all right, some 20 years prior. So this is pushing the story back, like I said. All right. Now, there's some, not all paleoanthropologists kind of agree on this. There's some that say that this is maybe a little bit more primate looking than, let's say, Lucy is. But as of right now, the majority of paleoanthropologists consider this to be the first kind of step on the evolutionary tree. All right. So our textbook is technically outdated. The next time they do a new edition of this textbook, they're going to have to include Ardi in there. All right. So this is kind of the remains that they discovered from Ardi. You had more teeth, parts of the cranium, skull, that jawbone. The big thing there was the femur as well as the pelvic bone, which is a little bit similar to Lucy, a little bit more kind of bold, kind of almost like thicker bone, if you will. All right. So the artist rendering of Ardi looks very primate, if you will. You can't see because on the look at the feet there. The one factor is that definitely the feet look a little bit more primate, in the sense with the use of the kind of like the big toe is almost like a thumb, if you will. And so like Lucy, Ardi spent time also in trees as well. All right, so they're not fully on the ground floor. All right, so this, like I said, changes the story a little bit. All right, now back to Australopithecine. One thing that essentially kind of not only vindicated Johansen, but also Dart was the discovery of not fossils, but also footprints. All right, and this was discovered by Mary Leakey, who we'll talk a little bit later as well. From the first family of paleoanthropology. She discovered about 4 years after the discovery of Lucy in 1978, what they believed to be footprints of a hominid that lived anywhere between about 3.7 million years ago. So that puts that in the time frame of Australopithecine. All right. And so this was in Tanzania in the Great Rift Valley in a very dry region there. Using potassium argon dating, they were able to determine how old these footprints were. All right, and so they're basically, it was what we call nuclear family. There's her Mary kind of measuring that. What you have is an adult male, probably an adult female, and then probably a child that runs off away from his parents, like most kids do. All right, and so using potassium argon dating, they're able to kind of like from the imprints determine how old it was, but also you can look at it as a little bit different of a footprint. It's not a modern human footprint; it's a little bit different than a primate. All right, so the theory is that this is kind of Australopithecine. This falls within that time frame, if you will. All right, so that out of Africa theory gets even more kind of entrenched in the kind of the contemporary academia of paleoanthropology. All right, now a second classification that up until the 70s was really what they would kind of classify as the missing link is our first classification of man, or Homo, which would be Homo habilis, which its name means skillful man. And I'll explain why it means skillful man. Now, all Homo habilis discoveries, like Australopithecine as well as Ardipithecus, are only found in Africa. This was first to probably appear in East Africa between 2.5 and 2 million years ago. All right, so about a million years, or so about 500, about a million years, probably kind of younger, if you will, than, let's say, Australopithecine. All right, based on the kind of shape of the cranium, probably about 50% larger brain than Australopithecines. And that's significant because what they did with that larger brain, with the items that they were kind of surrounded with, is the key that kind of separates them essentially from Australopithecine. All right. And so, again, all Homo habilis discoveries are in Africa. All right. The shape of the skull, while a little bit larger, also still has a very heavy brow, so it's still very primate looking, if you will. But the thing is not necessarily the look, but what Homo habilis is carrying in his hands here, which is significant because the name itself, meaning skillful man, is believed that they were able to use their larger brains to make stone tools, ushering what we refer to as the Paleolithic age, or the Old Stone Age. Paleo, again, meaning old. All right, so this theory is that Homo habilis would use his larger brain to kind of like take these stones and flake or flint them to create kind of a point there, where not use like we're tools we use today to build things and such. This was very rudimentary. Essentially, the theory is that they would use these stone tools to crack open bones to scavenge from game, to crack open to get bone marrow for more sustenance and nutrition, right? Because at this time, Homo habilis, our kind of human ancestors, were not at the top of the food chain, like I said, still. All right. So this is where they probably, and again, when you look at these stone tools, you're not going to be that impressed. These are some of the first kind of stone tools. All right. But paleoanthropologists noticed the kind of like the shape. They've been kind of chipped away, flaked or flinted, and they're basically very rudimentary to crack open bones, basically to extract bone marrow, if you will. All right. Now, the first major Homo habilis discovery was what they called East Africa man, which was discovered in 1960, also in Tanzania. By Mary and her husband, Louis Leakey, who were the preeminent paleoanthropologists of their day. All right. They uncovered it, like with Johansson and Tim White, by accident. The story was Louis was taking a nap. Mary was driving into town to get gas, petrol, and one of the cans fell out of the pickup truck, and she noticed something that caught her eye, and it happened to be fossil remains, but also the discovery of kind of like these stone tools around there. All right. And so up until 1974, this was considered probably the missing link, if you will. Okay. And then there's the Leakeys, which you probably have like a similar photo of your grandparents holding the jawbone of a 2 million year old hominid. At some point at grandma and grandpa's house. Okay. All right. So anybody got any questions? Any concerns?
No.
No? Well, is that okay? Is that all right? So let's say, I still see people not, they're awake. Oh, awesome. That's great.
Can you go back to the beginning? Because I missed the first two.
Okay. Hold up. Let me see. Let me go back. Right there.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Paleoanthropology, human evolution. And I'll put this on Google Classroom as well. All right. So tomorrow, I'm going to send out a kind of like a worksheet, primary source worksheet from the Leakeys, talking about kind of like how like they come about, like finding fossils and stuff like that. And then on Thursday, I want to finish up this section here, talking about getting us closer to kind of our modern human species. All right. And then we're going to have a meeting. The faculty's having a meeting on Thursday about what we're doing for, like, if we're going to go back to what we call remote or whatever, hybrid. So my plan is to test next week, either when we're back or if we're back or remotely. Okay. All right. So you guys got any questions?
So did you say that there's no meeting Thursday?
Yeah, no, there is Thursday. I'm going to finish up the notes on Thursday. Yeah, sorry, but we're having, I think we're having as a faculty a meeting as well. But yeah, no, we'll meet again here at 10:30, and I'm going to finish up the notes for this section. Okay.
Oh, also, sorry, that sheet that you posted yesterday, was that due last night?
You can turn it in today. That's fine. Okay. Just answer questions on a separate Google Doc. I'm still grading them.
Okay.
Yeah. That was mainly to kind of introduce this section. All right. So. Yeah, so you can still turn it in if nobody's turned it in yet. All right. Okay. Well, I will see you guys on Thursday. Have a good day, everybody.